clock strikes midnight and most of America sleeps peacefully in their beds. But for millions of night workers across the country, the real day is just beginning. What they don't know is that when the sun goes down, the veil between our world and something far more sinister becomes dangerously thin. Tonight, I'm going to share with you 10 absolutely terrifying encounters experienced by people who work the graveyard shift. These aren't just ghost stories your grandmother told you around a campfire. These are real accounts from real people who faced the unthinkable in the dead of night when they were completely alone and vulnerable. From hospital corridors that echo with the footsteps of patients who died decades ago, to security guards who discovered that some buildings are guarded by more than just cameras and alarms. Each story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about what lurks in the darkness. So turn down your lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself for a journey into the most terrifying night shift encounters ever documented. But I warn you, after hearing these stories, you might never look at the night the same way again. Are you ready to discover what really happens when the rest of the world is fast asleep? Before we start, give me a little favor. Only 1% of you actually hit the like button. Even though you love these horror stories, 1 second to smash that like helps me grow so much and keeps these daily nightmares coming. Let's dive into the story. Sarah Martinez had been working as a night nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Phoenix for 3 years when she encountered something that would forever change her understanding of life and death. It was a typical Tuesday night in October, the kind where the desert air carries an unusual chill that seems to seep into your bones. The oncology ward was quieter than usual. Only 12 of the 30 beds were occupied, and most patients were sleeping peacefully under the influence of their evening medications. Sarah was making her routine rounds at 2:15 in the morning when she first noticed something was wrong. Room 237 had been empty for 2 weeks since Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had passed away. The 78-year-old grandmother had been Sarah's favorite patient, always greeting her with a warm smile despite the pain she endured during her final months. Eleanor had no family left, just Sarah and the other night staff who had become like daughters to her. As Sarah walked past room 237, she noticed the call light was on. This was impossible. The room was empty, cleaned, and prepared for the next patient. The electrical systems had been checked just yesterday. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she stared at the glowing red light above the door. Maybe it's just a malfunction, she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled slightly. She had worked enough night shifts to know that hospitals held their own special kind of energy after dark. The combination of pain, hope, fear, and death created an atmosphere that even the most skeptical staff members acknowledged felt different than any other workplace. Sarah approached the door slowly, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished floor. She placed her hand on the handle and paused. The metal felt ice-cold, which was strange because the hospital maintained a constant temperature of 72 degrees throughout the building. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as it should, empty and waiting. The bed was made with crisp white sheets. The monitors were silent and dark, and the small bedside table held nothing but a box of tissues and a plastic water pitcher. But something felt wrong. The air in the room seemed thicker somehow, and Sarah could swear she smelled Eleanor's perfume, that distinctive lavender scent she wore every day of her stay. Sarah walked to the call button beside the bed and pressed it, turning off the light. As she did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Hello, Eleanor," Sarah whispered, feeling slightly foolish but unable to stop herself. "If you're here, I want you to know that we all miss you terribly. You were the kindest patient I ever cared for." The silence stretched for several seconds before Sarah heard it. A soft voice, barely above a whisper, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Thank you for holding my hand when I was scared." Sarah felt every hair on her arms stand up. She knew that voice. It was Eleanor's voice, weak and whispery just like it had been during her final days. But that was impossible. Eleanor had been gone for 2 weeks. Sarah had been there when she passed, had held her hand just like Eleanor mentioned, and had even attended her funeral. "Eleanor," Sarah said again, her voice stronger now. "What do you need?" The response came immediately, and this time Sarah was certain she wasn't imagining it. "Room 244. She needs help. Please hurry." Room 244 was 3 doors down, occupied by a middle-aged woman named Janet Collins who was recovering from surgery to remove a brain tumor. Janet had been stable all evening, showing no signs of distress during Sarah's last check an hour ago. Sarah rushed out of room 237 and hurried down the hallway. As she approached room 244, she could hear the distinctive sound of labored breathing from inside. She pushed open the door and found Janet Collins turning blue, her airway completely blocked by vomit that had occurred during her sleep. Sarah immediately hit the emergency call button and began clearing Janet's airway while other staff members rushed to help. They worked frantically for several minutes before Janet's breathing stabilized and her color returned to normal. The doctor who responded to the emergency later told Sarah that if Janet had gone without oxygen for even 2 more minutes, she would have suffered permanent brain damage or death. After the crisis was resolved and Janet was stable, Sarah returned to room 237. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the empty bed where Eleanor had spent her final weeks. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. The call light above the door flickered once, just for a second, and then went dark. From that night forward, Sarah began to notice other unusual occurrences during her shifts. Patients who had passed away months or even years earlier seemed to find ways to communicate when current patients were in danger. Call lights would activate in empty rooms, elevator buttons would be pressed by invisible fingers, and that distinctive lavender scent would appear whenever someone needed extra comfort during their darkest moments. Sarah eventually learned that she wasn't the only nurse who had experienced these phenomena. During a late-night break with her colleague Maria, she discovered that many of the veteran night staff had their own stories of former patients who seemed to watch over the ward. Dr. Peterson, who had worked at Mercy General for over 20 years, explained it best during one of their midnight conversations. He told Sarah that he believed some patients who had experienced exceptional care and kindness during their final days chose to remain in the place where they felt most loved, continuing to help others even after death. Whether it was science or spirits, Sarah never questioned these experiences again. She simply accepted them as part of working the night shift in a place where the boundary between life and death was always thinner than anywhere else. But the encounter that changed everything happened 6 months later, on a night when Sarah was working alone in a different wing of the hospital. She was covering for a colleague who had called in sick, working in the cardiac unit, where she was less familiar with the patients and their histories. At 3:30 in the morning, every call light on the entire floor activated simultaneously. Sarah stared at the nurse's station in disbelief as red lights blinked frantically above every single room. She had never seen anything like it in her 4 years of nursing. She began checking each room methodically, expecting to find confused patients or equipment malfunctions. Instead, she found every patient sleeping peacefully. The call buttons in each room showed no signs of being pressed, and all the equipment was functioning normally. As she worked her way down the hall, Sarah began to feel a growing sense of urgency that she couldn't explain. It was as if something was trying to tell her to hurry, to look more carefully, to not give up until she found what needed to be found. In the final room at the end of the hall, Sarah found him. An elderly man named Robert Hayes was lying still in his bed, but his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that immediately set off every alarm in Sarah's experienced mind. She checked his pulse and found it weak and thready. His blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and his breathing was shallow. Robert was experiencing internal bleeding from a complication related to his heart surgery 3 days earlier. If Sarah hadn't found him when she did, he would have died quietly in his sleep, with no one aware of his crisis until it was far too late to save him. The medical team worked through the rest of the night to stabilize Robert and get him back into surgery. He survived and made a full recovery, later telling Sarah that he had dreamed of a woman in a lavender dress who told him that help was coming and that he needed to hold on just a little bit longer. Sarah smiled when she heard this, knowing exactly who had been watching over Robert Hayes that night. Eleanor Whitmore had found another way to help, orchestrating an entire floor's worth of call lights to ensure that no one would suffer alone on her watch. These experiences taught Sarah that working the night shift in a hospital meant becoming part of something larger than just medicine and science. It meant accepting that love, compassion, and the human spirit could transcend even death itself, creating a network of protection that watched over both patients and caregivers during the darkest and most vulnerable hours. But was Eleanor really there? Or was it something else entirely guiding these miraculous interventions? Sarah would soon discover that not all supernatural encounters in the hospital were as benevolent as Eleanor's presence. Marcus Thompson had been working security at the abandoned Riverside shopping mall in Detroit for 8 months when he first encountered the shadow that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The mall had been closed to the public for over 3 years, but the property management company still required a security presence to prevent vandalism and theft while they searched for new tenants. Most nights, Marcus walked the empty corridors with nothing but his flashlight, radio, and the echo of his own footsteps for company. The mall was a ghost town of defunct stores, their metal security gates pulled down like closed eyelids, hiding the remnants of businesses that had once thrived with shoppers and commerce. The job paid well enough for what it was, mostly because nobody else wanted to work alone in such a creepy environment. Marcus had always been practical about supernatural claims, dismissing ghost stories as overactive imaginations or attention-seeking behavior. He figured that if he could handle 3 tours in Afghanistan, he could handle an empty shopping mall in Detroit. That confidence lasted exactly 8 months and 2 days. It was a Thursday night in November, and the first real snowfall of the season was coating the parking lot outside. Marcus was making his regular patrol route, starting at the main entrance and working his way through each wing of the mall methodically. He had developed a routine that took exactly 90 minutes to complete, checking every door, examining every window, and ensuring that all the emergency exits remained secure. He was halfway through the east wing when he first noticed it. At the far end of the corridor, near what used to be a department store anchor, something moved across his field of vision. It was quick, just a glimpse of darkness that seemed to flow from one side of the hallway to the other. Marcus stopped walking and aimed his flashlight toward the spot where he had seen the movement. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty storefronts and nothing else. He waited for several seconds, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate an intruder had somehow gotten into the building. The silence was complete except for the distant hum of the minimal electrical systems that kept the emergency lighting functional. Marcus shrugged and continued his patrol, making a mental note to check that area more carefully on his return trip. 20 minutes later, as he was examining the locks on a service corridor door, Marcus heard footsteps. Not the sharp click of hard shoes on tile, but the soft shuffling sound of someone walking slowly, deliberately, as if they were trying not to be heard. "This is security?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. "This is private property and you're trespassing. Identify yourself immediately." The footsteps stopped. Marcus waited, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. He had been required to call the police twice before when vandals had broken into the building, and he was prepared to do so again if necessary. 30 seconds passed in complete silence before the footsteps resumed, but now they seemed to be moving away from Marcus, heading deeper into the wing he had not yet patrolled. Marcus followed the sound, moving quickly but carefully through the darkened mall. His flashlight beam swept back and forth as he walked, creating moving shadows that danced across the walls and empty shop windows. The footsteps stayed just ahead of him, always around the next corner or behind the next pillar. This went on for nearly 10 minutes before Marcus realized he was being led in circles. The footsteps had guided him through the same section of the mall 3 times, always staying just out of sight, always one step ahead of his pursuit. He stopped in the center court of the mall, where a dried fountain sat surrounded by empty planters that had once held decorative plants. The acoustics in this area were strange, with sounds seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "I know you're here," Marcus said, speaking to the darkness around him. "I don't know what game you're playing, but this ends now. Show yourself or I'm calling the police." The response came immediately, but it wasn't what Marcus expected. Instead of footsteps or voices, every emergency light in the entire mall began to flicker. Not a random electrical malfunction, but a coordinated pattern that started at one end of the building and moved like a wave toward the center court where Marcus stood. As the lights flickered overhead, Marcus became aware of a sound that made his blood run cold. It was breathing, slow and deep, coming from right behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but found nothing there. The breathing continued, now seeming to come from his left. He turned again, and again found nothing. But the sound was unmistakable, the deliberate inhale and exhale of someone standing close enough to touch. Marcus felt his military training kick in, the calm focus that had kept him alive in combat zones. He stopped moving, stopped reacting to the sounds, and instead stood perfectly still while he analyzed the situation rationally. That was when he saw it clearly for the first time. The shadow was not cast by any object or person. It was a shape unto itself, roughly human in form but completely black, as if someone had cut a person-shaped hole in the air itself. It stood about 20 feet away, near the entrance to what had been a jewelry store, and it was watching him. Marcus aimed his flashlight directly at the shadow, but the beam seemed to pass through it without effect. The shadow did not retreat or react to the light in any way. It simply stood there, observing him with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. "What are you?" Marcus asked, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. The shadow began to move, not walking but gliding across the floor without any visible means of locomotion. It approached Marcus slowly, deliberately, and as it got closer, the temperature in the mall seemed to drop 20 degrees. Marcus felt his breath becoming visible in small puffs of vapor. His hands, which had remained steady during firefights and mortar attacks, began to tremble slightly as the shadow stopped just 5 feet away from him. Up close, Marcus could see that the shadow had depth and texture, like looking into a pool of liquid darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. Where a face should have been, there was nothing but a void that seemed to pull at his consciousness, drawing his attention deeper into its emptiness. The breathing sound grew louder, and Marcus realized it was coming from the shadow itself. Each exhale carried with it a whisper of words in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood on a primal level. The words spoke of loss, abandonment, and a hunger that could never be satisfied. Marcus tried to step backward but found that his feet would not move. It was as if the shadow exerted some kind of gravitational pull that kept him locked in place. He could move his arms and turn his head, but his legs simply would not obey his commands to retreat. The shadow raised what appeared to be an arm, reaching toward Marcus with fingers that seemed to be made of pure darkness. As it got closer, Marcus felt a cold unlike anything he had ever experienced, a chill that went beyond physical sensation and seemed to freeze his very soul. Just as the shadow's touch was about to make contact with his face, Marcus heard a sound that broke the spell completely. His radio crackled to life with the voice of his supervisor conducting a routine check-in from the security company's main office. "Marcus, this is base station. Please respond with your status report." The shadow's arm stopped inches from Marcus' face, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, neither moved. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow began to dissolve, not fading but collapsing in on itself like smoke being sucked down a drain. Marcus grabbed his radio with hands that were now shaking violently. Base station, this is Marcus. All secure. No incidents to report. Even as he said the words, he wondered why he was lying. Why wasn't he telling his supervisor about the shadow, about the footsteps, about the breathing that had seemed so real and so terrifying? The truth was that Marcus knew no one would believe him. More importantly, he realized that speaking about it might somehow give it more power, more reality than it already possessed. Marcus completed his shift that night, but he never forgot about the shadow. Over the following weeks, he researched the history of the mall and discovered that it had been built on the site of an old psychiatric hospital that had burned down in the 1960s. 43 patients and staff members had died in the fire, many of them trapped in the basement levels that had later become the foundation for the shopping center. Local urban legends spoke of shadow figures that appeared to people during times of extreme stress or isolation, feeding on fear and loneliness. Some believed these shadows were the spirits of those who had died feeling abandoned and forgotten, forever seeking the human connection they had been denied in life. Marcus never saw the shadow again, but he felt its presence during every shift thereafter. It watched him from empty storefronts, followed him down darkened corridors, and breathed just behind his ear during the quietest moments of the night. He quit the job 3 months later, but even now, years afterward, Marcus sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something is standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with that same ancient hunger he had encountered in the abandoned mall. But the shadow was just the beginning of what Marcus would discover about the places where the dead refused to rest. Roberto Silva had been driving a taxi in Boston for 15 years when he picked up the fare that would change his entire understanding of life, death, and the thin line that separates the two. It was a rainy Tuesday night in March, the kind of weather that kept most people indoors but created steady business for cab drivers willing to work the late shift. Roberto preferred the night hours. The city took on a different personality after midnight, quieter and more mysterious than during the busy daylight rush. His regular customers included hospital workers ending their shifts, bartenders closing up for the night, and the occasional airport passenger catching red-eye flights. He had just dropped off a nurse at Brigham and Women's Hospital and was heading toward downtown when his radio crackled with a pickup request. The dispatcher's voice was unusually quiet, almost hesitant, as she gave him the address. "Roberto, I have a fare for you at 1247 Beacon Street. Passenger requested you specifically. Says she's been waiting for you." Roberto frowned as he wrote down the address. He didn't recognize the location, and he couldn't remember any regular customers who lived in that particular area of Back Bay. But he had been requested by name before, usually by satisfied customers who appreciated his punctuality and friendly conversation. "On my way," he radioed back, turning his cab toward Beacon Street. The address led him to an elegant brownstone building that looked like it had been converted into high-end condominiums. The street was well lit and lined with similar buildings, the kind of neighborhood where parking spaces cost more per month than many people paid for rent. Roberto pulled up to the curb and honked once, as was his custom when arriving for a pickup. He could see lights on in several of the building's windows, but no one appeared at the entrance. He waited for 2 minutes, then honked again. Still no response. Roberto was about to radio the dispatcher to report a no-show when he saw her. A woman emerged from the shadows between 2 parked cars, as if she had been standing there all along waiting for him to notice her. She was elegantly dressed in a dark coat that looked expensive but somehow old-fashioned in its cut and style. Her hair was pulled back in a classic chignon, and even in the dim streetlight, Roberto could see that she was quite beautiful, with the kind of timeless features that could have belonged to any era from the past century. She approached the cab and got into the back seat without saying a word. Roberto turned to greet her and noticed immediately that something felt different about this passenger. The temperature in the cab seemed to drop several degrees, and there was an unusual stillness about her that he couldn't quite identify. "Good evening," Roberto said. "Where would you like to go?" The woman looked at him through the rearview mirror, and Roberto felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Her eyes were the palest blue he had ever seen, almost colorless, and they seemed to look right through him rather than at him. "Mount Auburn Cemetery," she said in a voice that was soft but carried perfectly through the cab's interior. "Gate 4, if you please." Roberto knew the cemetery well. It was one of the oldest and most beautiful in the Boston area, established in the 1830s and home to the graves of many famous historical figures. But it was nearly 2 in the morning, and the cemetery had been closed to the public for hours. "Ma'am, I should let you know that the cemetery is closed at this hour. The gates are locked from sunset to sunrise." The woman smiled, and Roberto felt his breath catch in his throat. Her smile was beautiful but somehow sad, carrying a weight of sorrow that seemed to fill the entire cab. "The gate will be open," she said simply. "Please drive." Roberto started the meter and pulled away from the curb. As he drove, he tried to make conversation with his passenger, as was his habit with most fares. But every question he asked was met with silence or single-word responses that didn't invite further discussion. Instead, she seemed more interested in watching the city pass by outside the windows, observing the late-night landscape with an intensity that suggested she was seeing it all for the first time, or perhaps the last. The drive to Mount Auburn Cemetery took 25 minutes through the mostly empty streets. During the entire trip, Roberto found himself glancing repeatedly at his passenger in the rearview mirror. There was something about her that he couldn't shake, something that felt familiar even though he was certain they had never met before. As they approached the cemetery, Roberto was surprised to see that Gate 4 was indeed standing open, despite the late hour. A security guard was supposed to lock all entrances at sunset, and Roberto had never seen any of the gates open after hours in all his years of driving in the area. He pulled up to the entrance and turned to tell his passenger they had arrived, but the back seat was empty. Roberto blinked hard, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. He turned on the cab's interior light and checked the entire back seat, even looking under it to see if somehow his passenger had fallen to the floor. But there was no trace of her anywhere in the vehicle. The meter showed a fare of $18.60. On the back seat where the woman had been sitting, Roberto found exact change for the ride plus a $5 tip, totaling $23.60 in old bills that looked like they hadn't been printed in decades. Roberto sat in his cab for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. He had been driving professionally for 15 years and had never experienced anything like this. Passengers didn't simply vanish from locked vehicles. People didn't leave exact change, including tips, without being told the fair amount. And cemetery gates didn't open themselves in the middle of the night. He was about to leave when curiosity got the better of him. Roberto parked his cab and walked through the open gate into Mount Auburn Cemetery. The grounds were illuminated by ornate street lamps that created pools of warm light among the trees and monuments. Roberto had visited the cemetery during daylight hours many times over the years, bringing tourists who wanted to see the graves of famous writers and historical figures. But at night, the place had an entirely different atmosphere, peaceful but charged with an energy that made the hair of his arms stand up. He walked slowly along the main path, not sure what he was looking for but feeling drawn deeper into the grounds by something he couldn't identify. The cemetery was larger than many city parks, with winding roads that connected different sections containing graves dating back nearly 2 centuries. After walking for about 10 minutes, Roberto found himself in a section of older graves marked by elaborate Victorian monuments and mausoleums. The stonework was intricate and beautiful, with angels, flowers, and religious symbols carved by craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through generations. That was when he saw her again. The woman from his cab was standing beside a large granite monument about 50 feet away. She was no longer wearing her dark coat, and in the lamplight Roberto could see that she was dressed in a white gown that seemed to glow with its own inner light. She was looking directly at him, and this time her smile was not sad but welcoming, as if she had been expecting him to follow her into the cemetery. Roberto walked toward her slowly, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. As he got closer, he could read the inscription on the monument beside which she stood: Catherine Marie Sullivan, beloved wife and mother, 1892 to 1924. Until we meet again. Roberto looked from the gravestone to the woman and back again. The dates would have made Catherine 32 years old when she died, nearly a century ago. The woman standing before him appeared to be exactly that age, with the same timeless beauty he had noticed in his cab. "You're Catherine?" Roberto said, surprised that he felt no fear, only a deep sense of sadness for this woman who had died so young. She nodded, and when she spoke, her voice carried on the night air like music. "I have been waiting so long for someone who would see me, really see me. Most people look right through me now, as if I never existed at all." Roberto understood then why she had felt familiar to him. Catherine had the look of someone who had been forgotten by time, whose story had been buried along with her body almost a century ago. "What happened to you?" Roberto asked gently. Catherine's expression grew sad again, and she glanced down at the gravestone that marked her final resting place. "I died in the influenza pandemic of 1924, leaving behind a husband and 2 small children. I was supposed to watch them grow up, supposed to grow old with the man I loved. Instead, I was buried here when I should have been home making breakfast for my family." Roberto felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to her story. The 1918 to 1924 influenza pandemic had killed millions of people worldwide, many of them young adults in the prime of their lives. "For nearly a century, I have been trying to find my way home," Catherine continued. "But the world has changed so much that I no longer recognize the places where I lived and loved. The house where my children took their first steps has been torn down and replaced. The church where I was married is now a parking lot. Everything I knew is gone." Roberto understood now why Catherine had appeared in his cab. She was lost, literally and figuratively, trying to navigate a world that had moved on without her. "Tonight was the first time in decades that anyone has been able to see me clearly, to speak with me as if I were really here. I wanted to ride through the city one more time, to see what it has become, before I finally accept that my time has passed." Catherine began to fade even as Roberto watched, becoming translucent like morning mist touched by the first rays of sunrise. "Thank you for the ride home," she whispered, her voice growing fainter with each word. "It's time for me to rest." Roberto reached out toward her, wanting to offer some comfort, but his hand passed through empty air. Catherine was gone, and he was alone among the monuments and memories of Mount Auburn Cemetery. He walked slowly back to his cab, where the money Catherine had left was still sitting on the back seat. But when Roberto picked up the bills to examine them more closely, they crumbled to dust in his hands, leaving nothing but the faint scent of lavender and old roses. Roberto never spoke about his encounter with Catherine Sullivan to his dispatcher, his family, or his fellow drivers. But he did visit the cemetery during daylight hours the following week, bringing fresh flowers to place on her grave. The groundskeeper told him that no one had visited Catherine's grave in over 20 years, not since her last surviving child had passed away. Roberto made it his personal mission to ensure that Catherine was no longer forgotten, visiting her grave every few months and leaving flowers that he paid for with his own money. Sometimes, late at night when he was driving through the city, Roberto would catch a glimpse of movement in his rearview mirror and wonder if Catherine had found her way into his cab again. But she never reappeared, and Roberto chose to believe that she had finally found the peace that had eluded her for nearly a century. However, Roberto's experience with the supernatural passengers of Boston was far from over. What happened next would test his understanding of the difference between helpful spirits and something much more dangerous. Jennifer Walsh had worked the night shift at the historic Grandview Hotel in Savannah, Georgia for 2 years when she encountered the guest who would teach her that not all supernatural visitors have peaceful intentions. The Grandview was a beautiful antebellum mansion that had been converted into a boutique hotel, complete with period furnishings, elaborate crown molding, and a reputation for being one of the most haunted buildings in a city famous for its ghost tours. Most of the hotel's paranormal activity was benign, the kind of gentle supernatural presence that actually attracted tourists rather than frightening them away. Guests often reported the scent of magnolias in rooms where no flowers were present, the sound of piano music drifting from the empty ballroom, and occasional glimpses of a woman in Victorian dress walking the upstairs hallways. Jennifer had grown accustomed to these phenomena during her time working at the hotel. The night shift was particularly active, with supernatural encounters happening 2 or 3 times per week. Management actually encouraged staff to keep detailed logs of paranormal experiences, using them as marketing material for the hotel's ghost tour packages. But what happened on a humid Thursday night in August was different from anything in those carefully documented encounters. It was the kind of experience that made Jennifer question whether some supernatural entities might not be as harmless as she had always believed. The trouble began at 11:45 when Jennifer was reviewing the next day's checkout list at the front desk. The hotel was fully booked with 28 guests, mostly tourists visiting Savannah for its historic architecture and legendary nightlife. Everyone had checked in earlier in the evening, and the building had settled into the quiet rhythm that characterized the overnight hours. Jennifer was updating her computer records when she became aware of someone standing at the front desk. She looked up to find a man in an expensive-looking suit waiting patiently for her attention. He was tall and thin, with dark hair slicked back and pale skin that seemed almost luminous in the lobby's antique lighting. "Good evening," Jennifer said, giving him her professional smile. "How can I help you?" "I would like a room for the night," the man said in a voice that was smooth and cultured, with an accent that sounded vaguely European but impossible to place precisely. Jennifer checked her computer screen, though she already knew the answer. "I'm sorry, but we're completely booked tonight. I can recommend several other hotels in the area that might have availability, or I could put you on a waiting list in case we have any last-minute cancellations." The man smiled, and Jennifer felt an unexpected chill run down her spine. There was something about his smile that didn't reach his eyes, something that suggested amusement at a private joke she wasn't sharing. "Check again," he said simply. Jennifer looked at her screen once more, and her breath caught in her throat. According to the computer, room 237 was now showing as available, despite the fact that she had just confirmed it was occupied by a couple from Atlanta who had checked in at 6 o'clock that evening. "There must be some kind of computer glitch," Jennifer said, reaching for the phone. "Let me call our guests in 237 to make sure they're settled in properly." Before she could dial, the man placed his hand over hers on the phone receiver. His skin was ice cold, so cold that Jennifer gasped and tried to pull her hand away. But his grip was surprisingly strong, holding her hand firmly against the phone. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice now carrying an undertone that sounded almost hypnotic. "Room 237 is available, just as your computer indicates. I'll take it for one night." Jennifer felt a strange fog settling over her thoughts, as if she were trying to think clearly through layers of cotton. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding and reaching for a registration card. The man filled out the paperwork with handwriting that looked like it belonged to another century, all flowing script and elaborate flourishes. He signed his name as Edmund Thorne and listed his address simply as traveling. When Jennifer asked for a credit card or cash payment, Edmund reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small leather pouch filled with gold coins that looked like they hadn't been minted in over 100 years. "Will this suffice?" he asked, placing 3 coins on the desk. Jennifer stared at the coins, knowing that accepting such unusual payment was completely against hotel policy. But the same strange fog that had settled over her thoughts made everything seem perfectly reasonable and normal. "Of course," she heard herself saying as she handed him the key to room 237. Edmund took the key and smiled again, that same cold expression that never touched his eyes. "Thank you, my dear. I do so appreciate your hospitality." He walked to the elevator with a gliding motion that seemed almost too smooth, as if his feet weren't quite touching the ground. Jennifer watched him until the elevator doors closed, then shook her head as if waking from a dream. She immediately checked her computer again and was alarmed to see that room 237 was indeed showing as occupied by Edmund Thorne, with no record of the Atlanta couple who should have been staying there. Jennifer grabbed her master key and hurried upstairs to investigate. When she knocked on the door of room 237, there was no answer. She used her key to enter and found the room exactly as housekeeping had left it that morning, with no signs that anyone had checked in earlier that evening. The bed was still made with crisp white sheets. The towels were fresh and unused, and there were no personal belongings anywhere in the room. But the temperature in the room was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the hotel, and there was a smell in the air that reminded Jennifer of old graves and decaying flowers. Jennifer hurried back downstairs and called the Atlanta couple's cell phone number from their registration. The wife answered on the second ring, sounding confused and disoriented. "We're not sure what happened," the woman explained. "We went to our room after dinner, and when we tried to use our key card, it wouldn't work. Then a hotel employee came and told us there had been a plumbing emergency and that we were being upgraded to a suite at your sister property downtown. A car came to pick us up, and they said all our charges would be comped for the inconvenience." Jennifer felt ice water flowing through her veins. The Grandview Hotel didn't have a sister property, and she had authorized no such room changes or transportation. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of mistake. Could you tell me what the hotel employee looked like who moved you?" He was very tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned suit. He had an unusual accent and was extremely polite. He said his name was Edmund and that he was the night manager. Jennifer's hands began to shake as she realized what had happened. Somehow, the man calling himself Edmund Thorne had arranged for the legitimate guests to be removed from room 237, clearing the way for his own occupancy through methods that defied all logical explanation. After ensuring that the Atlanta couple was safely settled in their new accommodations and would be fully compensated for the confusion, Jennifer tried to decide what to do about Edmund. Every instinct told her that something was terribly wrong, but she had no idea how to handle a supernatural guest who seemed to possess abilities far beyond anything she had encountered before. She decided to research the name Edmund Thorne, using the hotel's computer to search through local historical records. What she found made her blood run cold. Edmund Thorne had been a guest at the original Grandview Mansion in 1889, when it was still a private residence owned by the Caldwell family. According to newspaper accounts from that era, Thorne had been a mysterious European aristocrat who had charmed his way into Savannah society despite the fact that no one could verify his background or credentials. The newspaper reports painted Thorne as a sophisticated man who threw lavish parties and seemed to have unlimited financial resources. But they also mentioned that several young women had disappeared during his stay in Savannah, vanishing without a trace after being seen in his company. The mystery had ended abruptly when Thorne himself disappeared one night, leaving behind a room full of expensive belongings but no forwarding address. The missing women were never found, and the case had remained unsolved for over a century. But the most disturbing part of Jennifer's research was a photograph that accompanied one of the newspaper articles. The image was grainy and faded, as all photographs from that era were, but there was no mistaking the face. The man in the 1889 photograph looked exactly like the guest who had just checked into room 237. Jennifer tried to convince herself that it was just a coincidence, that the current Edmund Thorne must be a descendant of the historical figure. But she knew in her heart that she was dealing with something far more sinister than a family resemblance. At 2:30 in the morning, Jennifer received a call from room 237. Edmund's voice came through the phone with perfect clarity, as if he were standing right beside her rather than speaking from 3 floors above. "My dear, I'm having some difficulty with the room service menu. Could you perhaps bring me something to eat? I have such particular tastes, and I find that the hotel staff often understands my preferences better when we discuss them in person." There was something in his tone that made Jennifer's skin crawl, an underlying suggestion that his particular tastes had nothing to do with food from the kitchen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne, but room service ended at midnight. I can arrange for continental breakfast to be delivered to your room in the morning, or there are several 24-hour restaurants nearby that deliver." Edmund chuckled, a sound that carried no warmth whatsoever. "I think you misunderstand, my dear. I'm not interested in anything that can be delivered from a restaurant. My preferences are much more personal. Why don't you come upstairs so we can discuss the matter properly?" Jennifer felt that same strange fog beginning to settle over her thoughts again, the hypnotic influence that had made her check him in despite her better judgment. But this time she was ready for it, and she fought back with every ounce of mental strength she possessed. "I'm sorry, but I can't leave the front desk unattended during my shift. If you have any other needs that I can assist you with by phone, please let me know." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. When Edmund spoke again, his cultured politeness had been replaced by something cold and threatening. "You are being quite unreasonable, Jennifer. I had hoped we could handle this matter with civility, but you seem determined to be difficult." The fact that he knew her name, despite her not having introduced herself, sent fresh waves of terror through Jennifer's body. She hung up the phone without responding and immediately called hotel security. The security guard on duty was a retired police officer named Frank Martinez who had worked at the Grandview for 5 years. He had dealt with numerous supernatural encounters during his tenure and had developed a practical approach to managing paranormal guests. "Frank, I need you to check on the guest in room 237. Something's not right about him, and I'm genuinely afraid for the safety of our other guests." Frank took the elevator to the 2nd floor and knocked on the door of room 237. He reported back to Jennifer by radio 5 minutes later. "Jennifer, there's nobody in that room. The door was unlocked, so I went inside to check. It's completely empty, and it's cold enough in there to hang meat. But here's the weird part. The windows are all fogged up from the inside, like someone's been breathing on them for hours." Frank returned to the lobby and showed Jennifer something that made her gasp. In his hand were 3 gold coins, identical to the ones Edmund had used to pay for his room. "I found these on the pillow," Frank said. "Along with this." He handed Jennifer a handwritten note in the same elaborate script Edmund had used on his registration card. The message was brief but chilling. "My dear Jennifer, your lack of hospitality is most disappointing. I shall remember your discourtesy when next we meet. Until then, pleasant dreams." Jennifer and Frank spent the rest of the night researching Edmund Thorne more thoroughly, using resources at the local historical society and police department. They discovered that similar encounters had been reported at hotels throughout the southeastern United States over the past century. In each case, a man matching Edmund's description would check into a historic hotel using old gold coins for payment. He would make inappropriate advances toward female staff members, and when refused, he would disappear mysteriously, leaving behind only cold rooms and cryptic threats. Several of the women who had rejected his advances had reported ongoing harassment in the months following his visits. They experienced nightmares, unexplained cold spots in their homes, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Jennifer realized that she had become part of this pattern, and that Edmund Thorne's departure from the hotel did not necessarily mean the end of his attention toward her. Over the following weeks, Jennifer experienced exactly the kind of supernatural harassment that other women had reported. Her apartment would become inexplicably cold at night. She would wake up to find messages written in condensation on her bathroom mirror, and she often felt an invisible presence standing just behind her during her shifts at the hotel. The harassment continued for 3 months before suddenly stopping completely. Jennifer later learned that Edmund Thorne had checked into another historic hotel in Charleston, where he had encountered a night clerk who was less fortunate than Jennifer. The young woman had accepted his invitation to visit his room, and she was found 3 days later in the hotel's garden, drained of blood and bearing 2 puncture wounds on her neck. The incident had been covered up as a drug overdose, but Jennifer knew the truth. Edmund Thorne was not just a ghost or spirit, but something far more dangerous. A predator who had been hunting for over a century and would continue to do so until someone found a way to stop him permanently. Jennifer quit her job at the Grandview Hotel and moved to another state, but she never forgot the lesson she had learned during that terrifying night shift. Not all supernatural encounters are harmless visits from departed loved ones. Some entities that refuse to move on from the world of the living do so because they have unfinished business of a much darker nature. But Edmund Thorne was not the only dangerous presence that lurked in the shadows where night workers faced the unknown alone. Maria Santos had been working at Mickey's all-night diner outside of Albuquerque for 3 years when she served the customer who would show her that some hungers can never be satisfied, not even by death itself. The diner was a classic 1950s establishment that served truckers, late-shift workers, and insomniacs who couldn't find sleep in the desert darkness of New Mexico. Mickey sat at a lonely crossroads where Highway 285 met a smaller state road that led into the Sandia Mountains. During daylight hours, the location attracted tourists heading to hiking trails and scenic overlooks. But after midnight, the diner became an oasis of fluorescent light and hot coffee in a landscape that stretched empty and black in every direction. Maria had chosen the night shift because it paid better than days and because she was studying for her nursing degree at the local community college. The slower pace of the overnight hours gave her time to review her textbooks between customers, and the regular truckers had become like family to her over the years. She had seen her share of unusual customers during those late-night hours. Desert highways attracted drifters, wanderers, and people running from various kinds of trouble. But she had never encountered anyone quite like the man who walked into Mickey's at 2:45 on a Tuesday morning in October. He appeared suddenly, as if materializing from the darkness outside without passing through the diner's large front windows where Maria should have seen him approaching. One moment she was wiping down the counter and refilling the coffee machine, and the next moment he was sitting at the corner booth, studying the menu with intense concentration. The man was middle-aged, wearing clothes that looked expensive but somehow outdated, as if they had been tailored decades ago and preserved perfectly. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his dark hair was slicked back in a style that belonged to an earlier era. But it was his eyes that made Maria feel uneasy, pale gray eyes that seemed to look right through her rather than at her. "Good evening," Maria said, approaching his table with a coffee pot and a cup. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" The man looked up at her with those unsettling gray eyes and smiled. His teeth were perfectly white and straight, but something about his smile made Maria's skin crawl. "That would be lovely, my dear. I find myself quite hungry tonight, and I do hope you can satisfy my particular appetites." There was something in the way he said "particular appetites" that made Maria feel like prey being studied by a predator. She poured his coffee with hands that trembled slightly, trying to maintain her professional composure despite the growing sense of unease. "Our kitchen is open all night," Maria said. "We have everything from breakfast to dinner, plus fresh pie that I made myself this afternoon. The man picked up his coffee cup and inhaled the steam as if he were savoring the aroma, though Maria noticed he didn't actually drink any of the coffee. "How long have you worked here, my dear?" he asked, ignoring her mention of the menu. "3 years," Maria replied, wondering why she felt compelled to answer such a personal question from a stranger. "And do you work alone during these late hours?" Maria felt alarm bells going off in her head. The question was too personal, too direct, and there was something predatory in the way he asked it that made her instinctively want to lie about her circumstances. "No," she said firmly. "My manager is in the back office, and we have security that checks on us regularly throughout the night." This was only partially true. Her manager, Mickey, usually went home around midnight, leaving Maria alone until the morning shift arrived at 6. But something about this customer made her feel the need to project an image of safety and supervision. The man smiled again, and Maria could swear his teeth looked sharper than they had just moments before. "I see. And what time does this security make their rounds?" Maria realized she was being interrogated, and she didn't like it one bit. She had dealt with difficult and inappropriate customers before, but this felt different, more dangerous somehow. "I really should check on my other customers," she said, looking around the diner at the empty booths and counter stools. "Is there anything from the menu I can get for you?" The man followed her gaze around the empty restaurant and chuckled softly. "It appears we're quite alone, my dear. No need to pretend otherwise." Maria felt ice water flowing through her veins. She had been certain the diner was empty when the man arrived, but she hadn't been paying close attention to the parking lot. There could have been other customers who had left while she was in the kitchen, or perhaps she had simply miscounted the occupied tables. But as she looked around more carefully, Maria realized that not only were there no other customers in the diner, there were no cars in the parking lot except for her own Honda Civic. The man had arrived without any vehicle, appearing from the dark desert as if he had walked for miles through the empty landscape. "I think you should leave," Maria said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you're not going to order anything, I need to ask you to go." The man's pale eyes seemed to grow brighter in the fluorescent lighting of the diner. He leaned back in his booth and studied Maria with the same intensity a scientist might use to examine a particularly interesting specimen. "But I am ordering something, my dear. I'm ordering exactly what I came here for." He stood up from the booth, and Maria noticed that he was much taller than she had realized, well over 6 feet with a thin frame that seemed to unfold like a spider emerging from hiding. As he moved toward her, Maria backed away instinctively, putting the counter between them. "I'm going to call the police," she said, reaching for the phone that sat beside the cash register. "Please do," the man said pleasantly. "I would be quite interested to see what response you receive at this hour in such a remote location." Maria dialed 911, but the line was completely dead. No dial tone, no busy signal, just absolute silence as if the phone had been disconnected from any outside communication. The man laughed, a sound that contained no humor whatsoever. Technology can be so unreliable, especially in areas where the spiritual energy runs as strongly as it does here. "Did you know that this diner sits at the intersection of several Native American spirit paths? The indigenous people considered this area sacred, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes very thin." Maria realized she was dealing with something far more dangerous than just an unusual customer. She grabbed a large kitchen knife from behind the counter and held it between herself and the approaching man. "Stay back," she warned. "I mean it." The man stopped moving and tilted his head to one side, like a curious animal studying something it didn't quite understand. "How fascinating. You can sense what I am, can't you?" Most humans are completely oblivious until it's far too late. Maria didn't understand what he meant, but she knew with absolute certainty that her life was in danger. She had grown up in New Mexico and had heard stories from her grandmother about creatures that walked the desert at night, beings that looked human but hungered for things that no living person should crave. "What are you?" she whispered. The man's appearance began to change as Maria watched. His pale skin became even more translucent, revealing dark veins underneath like a roadmap of decay. His perfectly styled hair became wispy and gray, and his expensive clothes aged before her eyes, becoming faded and moth-eaten as if decades were passing in seconds. "I am hungry, my dear. Hungrier than you can possibly imagine. Do you have any idea what it's like to crave sustenance that can never satisfy you? To spend eternity searching for something that will ease the gnawing emptiness that consumes you from within?" Maria raised the knife higher, though she suspected it would be useless against whatever this creature was. "I don't know what you're talking about, but you need to leave now." The man took another step toward her, and Maria could smell something like rotting meat mixed with old flowers, the scent of death and decay that no amount of cologne could cover. "I died in 1953, right here at this crossroads. My car broke down on a hot summer night, and I waited for help that never came. I died of thirst and exposure, alone and forgotten, while people drove past without stopping to help." Maria remembered hearing stories about a man who had died at the crossroads decades ago, but she had always assumed they were just local folklore, the kind of ghost stories that every small community collected over time. "Since then, I have been trying to satisfy the hunger that grows stronger every year. I have discovered that the life force of young people, especially those who work alone in isolated places, can provide temporary relief from the emptiness." Maria understood now what kind of creature she was facing. This was not a ghost or spirit seeking to resolve unfinished business. This was something that fed on the living, something that had been hunting for decades while growing more desperate and dangerous with each passing year. "You can't have me," she said, surprising herself with how strong her voice sounded. The creature that had once been a man smiled one final time, and Maria saw that its teeth had indeed become razor-sharp, designed for tearing rather than chewing. "We shall see about that, my dear." The creature lunged toward Maria with speed that no human could possess. She swung the knife in a desperate arc, more by instinct than planning, and felt it connect with something solid. The creature shrieked, a sound like metal being torn apart, and staggered backward. Where the knife had struck, the creature's form began to waver like heat shimmer rising from summer pavement. Instead of blood, a dark substance that looked like liquid shadow poured from the wound. Maria didn't wait to see what would happen next. She ran for the diner's back exit, the one that led to the employee parking area where her car waited. Behind her, she could hear the creature recovering from her attack, its footsteps echoing strangely as if it were running on surfaces that didn't quite exist. She reached her Honda and fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely insert the key into the lock. The creature appeared at the back door of the diner just as Maria got her car started. In her rearview mirror as she drove away, Maria could see the creature standing in the parking lot, watching her escape. But instead of pursuing her, it simply stood there as if it knew something she didn't, as if her escape was only temporary. Maria drove straight to the sheriff's office in town, where she told her story to a skeptical deputy who clearly thought she had been the victim of a robbery attempt rather than a supernatural encounter. But when they returned to the diner at dawn to investigate, they found evidence that supported Maria's account. The corner booth where the creature had been sitting was covered with a thin layer of dust, as if no one had cleaned it in decades. The coffee cup it had touched was cracked straight through, though it had been intact when Maria poured the coffee. And there were dark stains on the floor behind the counter that looked like the shadow substance Maria had seen pouring from the creature's wound. Most convincing of all, the security camera that monitored the dining area showed Maria talking to empty air, pouring coffee for no one, and apparently having a conversation with herself before suddenly running for the back exit. But Maria knew what she had experienced, and she knew that the creature was still out there, still hungry, still hunting for the sustenance it could never find. She quit her job at Mickey's all-night diner and moved back to her hometown of Santa Fe, where she could work day shifts and avoid the isolated places where such creatures seemed to thrive. But she never forgot the lesson she had learned during that terrifying night. Some beings that refuse to move on from this world do so because death has not freed them from their appetites. Instead, it has made those appetites eternal and unsatisfiable, turning them into predators that will hunt forever without ever finding the peace they crave. But Maria's encounter with the creature at Mickey's diner was just one example of the dangers that night workers faced when they found themselves alone with beings that should no longer exist. Harold Peterson had been working as a night janitor at Lincoln Elementary School in Portland, Oregon for 7 years when he discovered that some lessons from the past refused to stay buried in history books. The school was built in 1923, and its red brick walls and tall windows had witnessed nearly a century of childhood laughter, learning, and the occasional tragedy that seems to haunt all institutions that have existed long enough to accumulate their share of sorrow. Harold preferred the night shift because it allowed him to work in peace without the chaos of hundreds of children running through the hallways. He took pride in ensuring that the classrooms were spotless when teachers and students arrived each morning, and he had developed an efficient routine that allowed him to complete his work while listening to audiobooks and podcasts through his earphones. The job paid well enough to support Harold and his wife Martha, who had been battling cancer for the past 2 years. The health insurance provided by the school district was excellent, and the flexible schedule allowed Harold to take Martha to her medical appointments during the day while still maintaining steady employment. Harold had always been a practical man who didn't put much stock in supernatural claims or ghost stories. When other staff members mentioned unusual occurrences in the older parts of the building, Harold attributed them to settling foundations, old plumbing, and the kind of creaking and groaning that any 90-year-old building would produce. That skepticism lasted exactly 7 years and 3 months. It was a Thursday night in November, and Harold was cleaning the third-floor classrooms that housed the oldest students at Lincoln Elementary. This section of the building retained much of its original 1920s architecture, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows that overlooked the playground and parking lot below. Harold was mopping the floor of Mrs. Patterson's 5th-grade classroom when he first noticed something was different. The room felt colder than usual, despite the fact that the building's heating system had been running normally all evening. He checked the thermostat on the wall and found it set to the standard 68 degrees, but the actual temperature felt closer to 50. Harold assumed there might be a problem with the heating unit that served this section of the building. Old schools were notorious for having heating and cooling systems that worked inconsistently, and he made a mental note to report the issue to the maintenance supervisor in the morning. He was wringing out his mop in the industrial bucket when he heard it for the first time. The sound of children's voices, faint but unmistakable, seemed to be coming from the classroom next door. Harold paused and listened carefully, wondering if perhaps some students had stayed late for an after-school activity that he hadn't been informed about. But as he listened more closely, Harold realized that the voices didn't sound quite right. They were thin and distant, as if they were coming from much farther away than the next room. And there was something about the cadence and pronunciation that sounded old-fashioned, like the way people spoke in movies from the 1930s and 1940s. Harold removed his earphones and walked to the door connecting Mrs. Patterson's classroom to Mr. Rodriguez's room next door. He pressed his ear to the door and listened carefully. The voices were definitely coming from the other classroom, but they seemed to fade in and out like a radio station that was just barely within reception range. He could make out fragments of what sounded like a geography lesson. A woman's voice, presumably a teacher, was asking questions about state capitals and major rivers. Children's voices responded eagerly, but the words were often difficult to understand, as if they were being spoken through layers of cloth or from the bottom of a deep well. Harold tried the door handle and found it unlocked, He pushed the door open slowly and peered into Mr. Rodriguez's classroom. The room was empty and dark, exactly as he had left it after cleaning it an hour earlier. But the voices continued, now seeming to come from all around him rather than from any specific location. Harold turned on the overhead lights, and the voices stopped abruptly, as if someone had suddenly switched off a recording. "Hello?" Harold called out, feeling slightly foolish but unable to shake the sense that he wasn't alone in the building. "Is anyone there?" The silence that followed was complete except for the distant hum of the heating system and the occasional sound of traffic from the street outside. Harold searched the entire classroom, checking behind desks and in closets, but found no explanation for the voices he had heard. He was about to leave when he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. On the blackboard at the front of the room, someone had written a lesson in chalk, despite the fact that Harold had cleaned and erased all the boards in this classroom just an hour earlier. The writing was in an old-fashioned script that looked like it had been written by someone who had learned penmanship in an era when handwriting was considered an art form. The lesson was about the geography of the United States as it existed in 1936, complete with references to territories that had not yet become states and boundaries that had been redrawn decades ago. Harold stared at the blackboard for several minutes, trying to find a logical explanation for what he was seeing. Could one of the teachers have written this lesson as part of a historical project? Could some students have sneaked into the building to play a prank? Neither explanation made sense. The building was locked and alarmed, and Harold had been working in the adjacent classroom where he would have heard anyone entering or leaving. Moreover, the handwriting looked exactly like the kind of penmanship that teachers used in the 1930s, when this lesson would have been current rather than historical. Harold took a photograph of the blackboard with his cell phone, then erased it carefully before continuing with his cleaning routine. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched as he worked, as if invisible eyes were observing his every movement. The feeling persisted as he moved through the rest of the third-floor classrooms. In each room, Harold found evidence of recent use that he couldn't explain. Desks that had been arranged in neat rows were now grouped in clusters. Books that he had placed in organized stacks were spread across tables as if students had been using them for research. And in one room, he found the faint smell of chalk dust in the air, despite the fact that the school had switched to dry erase markers years ago. But it was in the last classroom that Harold encountered something that would change his entire understanding of what was possible in the rational world he thought he knew. Mrs. Henderson's fourth-grade classroom was located at the end of the hallway, in a corner of the building that had been part of the original 1923 construction. The room had tall windows on two walls and retained many of the architectural details that had been removed from other parts of the building during various renovation projects. Harold entered the room and immediately felt the same intense cold that he had experienced in Mrs. Patterson's classroom. But this time, the cold was accompanied by something else, a presence that felt so strong it was almost physical. Harold turned on the overhead lights and gasped at what he saw. Every desk in the classroom was occupied by a faint, translucent figure of a child. They were dressed in clothing from the 1930s, with the boys wearing knickers and suspenders, and the girls in simple dresses with their hair in braids or bobs. At the front of the room stood a woman in a long dark dress, her hair pinned up in the style of the era. She was writing on the blackboard with a piece of chalk that made no sound as it moved across the surface. Harold rubbed his eyes hard, certain that he must be hallucinating from exhaustion or stress. But when he looked again, the figures were still there, still engaged in their ghostly lesson as if Harold's presence meant nothing to them. The teacher turned from the blackboard and looked directly at Harold. Her face was kind but sad, with eyes that held a depth of sorrow that made Harold's heart ache just to look at them. "Mr. Peterson," she said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away, "we've been waiting for you to see us. We've been trying so hard to get your attention." Harold felt his knees go weak, and he grabbed the doorframe for support. The teacher knew his name, though he had never seen her before in his life. But more than that, there was something familiar about her voice, something that tugged at memories he couldn't quite access. "Who are you?" Harold managed to whisper. "I am Miss Caroline Morrison, and these are my students from the class of 1937. We died in the influenza outbreak that winter, 17 children and their teacher, all taken within the span of 3 weeks." Harold remembered reading about the 1937 flu epidemic in the local historical society's archives. It had been one of the worst public health crises in Portland's history, claiming hundreds of lives throughout the city. Many schools had been closed for weeks, and some had lost entire classrooms of students and teachers. "We've been here ever since," Miss Morrison continued, "waiting for someone who could see us, someone who could help us finish what we started." "What do you need?" Harold asked, surprised by how calm his voice sounded despite the impossible nature of the conversation. One of the children, a boy with red hair and freckles, raised his hand just as he would have done in life. Miss Morrison nodded to him, and he stood beside his desk. "We were working on a special project when we got sick," the boy said. "A time capsule that was supposed to be opened in the year 2000. We wanted to leave a message for the children of the future, to tell them about our hopes and dreams." A girl with dark braids raised her hand next. "We never got to finish it because we all died before we could write our letters and seal the capsule. We've been waiting for someone to help us complete our project." Harold listened as the ghostly students explained their unfinished time capsule project. They had been working on letters to future students, drawings of their families and homes, and small mementos that represented their lives in 1937. The project had been Miss Morrison's idea, a way to help her students understand their place in the flow of history and their connection to future generations. But the influenza epidemic had struck before they could complete the project. The children had died one by one, followed by their teacher, leaving behind an unfinished lesson that had haunted them for over 80 years. "We can't rest until we finish what we started," Miss Morrison explained. "It's our unfinished homework, you might say. We need someone from your time to help us write our letters and seal our capsule properly." Over the following weeks, Harold worked with the ghostly class to complete their time capsule project. He would arrive early for his shift and spend hours in Mrs. Henderson's classroom, taking dictation as the children told him what they wanted to say to future students. The letters were heartbreaking in their innocence and hope. The children wrote about their dreams of becoming doctors, teachers, and inventors. They described their families, their pets, and their favorite games. They expressed wonder about what the world might look like in the year 2000, imagining flying cars and cities in space. Harold also helped them gather the physical items for their time capsule. He searched antique shops for toys and books from the 1930s that matched the children's descriptions of their treasured possessions. He found period-appropriate paper and pens to make the letters look authentic to their era. When the project was finally complete, Harold sealed the time capsule in a metal box and buried it in the school garden with the help of the current principal, who had become intrigued by Harold's research into the school's history. On the night Harold buried the time capsule, he returned to Mrs. Henderson's classroom one final time. Miss Morrison and her students were waiting for him, but now they looked different. The sadness that had defined their expressions had been replaced by peace and contentment. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," Miss Morrison said. "You've helped us finish our lesson at last." One by one, the ghostly students stood and walked toward a bright light that had appeared at the back of the classroom. They turned to wave goodbye to Harold before disappearing into the light, their faces glowing with joy at finally being able to move on to whatever comes after this life. Miss Morrison was the last to leave. She approached Harold and placed a translucent hand on his shoulder. He felt a warmth spread through his body, a sensation of being blessed by someone who had dedicated her life to teaching and caring for children. "Your wife is going to be fine," she whispered. "The treatment is working better than the doctors realize." She'll be with you for many more years." Then Miss Morrison followed her students into the light, and Harold was alone in the empty classroom. Martha's cancer went into complete remission 2 months later, baffling her oncologists who had prepared Harold for the worst. But Harold wasn't surprised by her recovery. He had learned that sometimes the departed find ways to offer gifts to the living, blessings that transcend the boundaries between life and death. Harold continued working at Lincoln Elementary for 3 more years before retiring. He never encountered Miss Morrison or her students again, but he often felt their presence in the building, a gentle reminder that some lessons transcend death itself. The time capsule was officially opened in a ceremony on the school's centennial in 2023. The letters from Miss Morrison's class brought tears to the eyes of everyone who read them, and the local newspaper ran a feature story about the ghostly students who had waited over 80 years to complete their homework. But Harold knew the real lesson wasn't about unfinished projects or supernatural encounters. It was about the power of compassion, the importance of helping others complete their unfinished business, and the understanding that love and dedication can persist even beyond death itself. However, not all encounters with the spirits of the past would prove as benevolent as Harold's experience with Miss Morrison and her students. Tommy Rodriguez had been working the overnight shift at Bill's Last Chance gas station on Highway 50 in Nevada for 6 months when he met the customer who taught him that some roads lead to destinations that no living person should ever reach. The gas station sat alone in the high desert, 60 miles from the nearest town, serving as a beacon of civilization for travelers crossing one of America's loneliest highways. Bill's Last Chance was aptly named. The next gas station in either direction was over 100 miles away, making Tommy's workplace a crucial stop for anyone brave enough to drive Highway 50 after dark. The job paid well because of its isolation, but it also meant spending 8 hours alone in a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly into star-filled darkness. Tommy had grown up in Las Vegas and was accustomed to desert environments. But there was something different about Highway 50 that he had never experienced before. The silence was deeper than any he had known, broken only by the occasional truck or car passing through the night. And there were times, especially during the deepest part of the night, when Tommy felt like he was the only living person for hundreds of miles in any direction. Most of his customers were long-haul truckers who knew the highway well and appreciated finding a friendly face and hot coffee in the middle of nowhere. Tommy had developed relationships with many of the regular drivers, learning their routes and their stories during brief conversations while they fueled up and stretched their legs. But it was the irregular customers who made the job interesting. Highway 50 attracted people who were traveling for reasons they rarely shared. Individuals who seemed to be running from something or searching for something they couldn't quite name. Tommy had learned not to ask too many questions and to accept payment without judging the strange assortment of humanity that appeared from the desert darkness. The customer who changed everything arrived on a Tuesday night in December, during a winter storm that had been building across the high desert for hours. Snow was falling steadily, unusual for this part of Nevada, and the temperature had dropped to well below freezing. Tommy was restocking the coffee machine when he heard the bell above the front door chime. He looked up to see a woman entering the station, shaking snow from her long dark hair and stamping her feet on the rubber mat just inside the door. She was beautiful in an old-fashioned way, with pale skin and red lips that looked like they had been painted by a Hollywood makeup artist from the 1940s. Her clothing matched that era as well, a long coat with fur trim and high heels that clicked against the linoleum floor as she approached the counter. "Terrible weather tonight," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Tommy couldn't identify. "I'm so grateful to find your station open." Tommy smiled and nodded toward the coffee machine. "Just made a fresh pot if you're interested, and we have sandwiches and snacks if you're hungry." The woman glanced around the station's interior, taking in the racks of motor oil, the display of maps and travel guides, and the security camera that monitored the cash register area. How wonderfully authentic, she said with what sounded like genuine pleasure. It's exactly like the stations I remember from when I used to travel this road regularly. Tommy was curious about her comment. The station had been built in the 1980s and hadn't changed much since then, but it certainly wasn't old enough to evoke memories from the 1940s, which seemed to match her style of dress and speech. Have you been through here before? Tommy asked. Oh yes, many times, though it's been quite a while since my last visit. The road has changed so much over the years. The woman walked to the coffee machine and poured herself a cup, adding cream and sugar with practiced efficiency. As she moved, Tommy noticed that her feet made no sound on the floor despite her high-heeled shoes. Are you traveling far tonight? Tommy asked, making conversation while keeping an eye on the security monitor that showed the parking lot outside. Farther than most people would believe possible, the woman replied with a mysterious smile. Tommy looked at the monitor more closely and realized something strange. The parking lot showed only his own pickup truck covered with snow. There were no other vehicles anywhere in the camera's field of view, which covered the entire area where customers normally parked. How did you get here? Tommy asked, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. The woman took a sip of her coffee and looked directly into Tommy's eyes. Her gaze was intense and seemed to look right through him, as if she could see things about him that he didn't even know about himself. I walk the road, she said simply. I've been walking it for a very long time. Tommy felt his heart rate increase as he processed what she was telling him. The nearest town was 60 miles away, and the temperature outside was well below zero. No one could survive walking that distance in such conditions, especially not dressed in 1940s clothing that offered little protection from the elements. That's impossible, Tommy said, though even as he spoke the words, he realized he was stating the obvious to someone who clearly existed in a realm where normal rules didn't apply. The woman laughed, a sound that was musical but somehow sad, as if it carried the weight of decades of loneliness and loss. Many things are impossible, young man, until they become necessary. I died on this road in 1947, and I've been walking it ever since, looking for someone who can help me find my way home. Tommy stared at the woman, trying to process what she had just told him. She was claiming to be dead, to have been walking Highway 50 for over 70 years, searching for something that had eluded her for decades. But she looked completely solid and real. She had poured coffee, she was speaking normally, and she cast a reflection in the security monitor behind the counter. If she was a ghost, she was unlike any supernatural entity Tommy had ever heard described in stories or movies. What happened to you in 1947? Tommy asked, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. The woman's expression grew sad, and she stared out the window at the falling snow as if seeing something from the distant past. My name is Helen Morrison, and I was driving from Los Angeles to Denver with my fiancé, Richard. We were going to be married on New Year's Eve, and we had stopped in Denver to meet his parents before the wedding. Helen paused and took another sip of her coffee before continuing. We were driving through a blizzard much like this one when our car went off the road about 10 miles east of here. Richard was killed instantly when we hit the rocks, but I survived the crash with only minor injuries. Tommy listened intently as Helen continued her story. I tried to walk for help, but I became lost in the storm. I wandered for hours in the snow and cold before finally collapsing from exhaustion and hypothermia. They found our bodies 3 days later when the storm cleared. The details of Helen's story felt authentic, and Tommy found himself believing every word despite the impossibility of what she was claiming. For over 70 years, I've been walking this road, trying to find my way back to Richard. But I can never locate the place where we crashed, and I can never find him among the other spirits that wander these desert highways. Tommy felt a deep sadness for Helen's plight. She had been trapped for decades, unable to move on because she couldn't complete her journey to be reunited with the man she had planned to marry. "What can I do to help you?" Tommy asked. Helen's eyes brightened with hope for the first time since she had entered the station. "I need someone with a car to drive me to the crash site. I've tried to find it on my own, but the landscape has changed so much over the years. The road has been rerouted several times, and landmarks I remember are no longer there." Tommy looked outside at his pickup truck, barely visible through the falling snow. The storm was getting worse, and driving anywhere in such conditions would be dangerous for a living person, let alone someone trying to help a ghost find peace. But something in Helen's expression convinced him that this might be her only chance to find what she had been seeking for over 7 decades. "I'll help you," Tommy heard himself saying, "but we'll have to wait until the storm passes. It's too dangerous to drive in this weather." Helen nodded gratefully. "I've waited this long. I can wait a few more hours." She sat down in one of the plastic chairs near the window and continued sipping her coffee while watching the snow fall. Tommy tried to focus on his normal duties, restocking shelves and cleaning the restroom, but he found himself stealing glances at Helen every few minutes. She seemed solid and real, but there were small things about her that reinforced her supernatural nature. Her coffee cup never seemed to empty despite the fact that she drank from it regularly. Her reflection in the security monitor sometimes flickered or appeared slightly out of focus, and the temperature in the station had dropped noticeably since her arrival, as if her presence brought some of the winter cold inside with her. Around 4 in the morning, the snow began to let up, and by 5 o'clock, the storm had passed completely. The sky was clear and filled with stars, and the desert landscape was transformed into a wonderland of white that sparkled in the moonlight. "It's time," Helen said, standing up from her chair and walking toward the door. Tommy grabbed his coat and keys, leaving a note for his replacement explaining that he had to leave early for a family emergency. He felt bad about lying, but he couldn't think of any other explanation that wouldn't result in questions he couldn't answer. Helen directed Tommy east on Highway 50, toward the Utah border. As they drove through the snowy landscape, she pointed out landmarks that had changed over the decades, explaining how the road had been moved and straightened to accommodate modern traffic. "The original highway curved more through the hills," Helen explained. "It was narrower and followed the natural contours of the land rather than cutting straight through it." After driving for about 20 minutes, Helen suddenly became agitated. "Stop here," she said urgently. "This is where it happened." Tommy pulled over to the side of the road and looked around. They were in a desolate area with rocky hills on both sides and no signs of human habitation anywhere in sight. "I don't see anything," Tommy said. Helen got out of the truck and walked toward a cluster of large boulders about 50 feet from the road. Tommy followed her, his boots crunching in the snow. "Here," Helen said, kneeling beside one of the rocks. "This is where Richard died." Tommy looked more closely and could see the faint outline of twisted metal barely visible beneath decades of accumulated sand and debris. It was the remains of a car that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. "But where is Richard?" Helen asked, her voice filled with anguish. "I can feel that he's here, but I can't see him." Tommy walked around the crash site, not sure what he was looking for, but hoping to find some clue that would help Helen find peace. That's when he saw him. Standing beside the largest boulder was the translucent figure of a man in 1940s clothing, watching Helen with an expression of infinite sadness and love. "He's here," Tommy called to Helen. "He's right beside that big rock." Helen spun around and looked where Tommy was pointing, but her expression remained confused and desperate. "I don't see him," she cried. "I can feel his presence, but I can't see him." "Why can't I see him?" Tommy realized that Helen's decades of wandering had somehow separated her from her ability to perceive Richard's spirit, even though they were both trapped in the same location. He approached the ghostly figure of Richard, who seemed to recognize that Tommy could see him. She's been looking for you for over 70 years, Tommy said. Richard nodded sadly. And I've been waiting for her just as long. But she became lost in her search, and the trauma of our deaths created a barrier between us that we cannot cross alone. What do I need to do? Tommy asked. Take her hand, Richard said. Form a connection between us so that she can see me clearly. Tommy walked back to Helen and took her cold hand in his. Immediately, he felt a surge of energy pass through him, as if he were completing an electrical circuit that had been broken for decades. Helen gasped and looked toward the boulder where Richard stood waiting. For the first time in over 70 years, she could see the man she had died trying to reach. Richard, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The ghostly figure of Richard walked toward them, his form becoming more solid and visible as he approached. When he reached Helen, he took her other hand, and Tommy found himself standing between two people who had been separated by death for most of a century. Thank you, Richard said to Tommy. You've given us the greatest gift imaginable. Helen turned to Tommy with tears of joy in her eyes. I can never repay what you've done for us. Then both spirits began to glow with a warm, golden light that seemed to come from within them. They looked younger and happier than they had since Tommy first encountered them, as if the reunion had restored them to the people they had been before their tragic deaths. We can go home now, Helen said, and Tommy understood that she was referring to whatever comes after this life, the destination that neither of them had been able to reach alone. The golden light grew brighter until Tommy had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, both Helen and Richard were gone, leaving only Tommy standing in the snow beside the long-forgotten remains of their car. Tommy drove back to the gas station as the sun was rising over the desert, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. He had witnessed something that most people would never believe, but he felt privileged to have played a role in reuniting two souls who had been lost for over 7 decades. When his replacement arrived for the morning shift, Tommy tried to explain why he had left his post during the night, but every time he attempted to tell the story, it sounded so unbelievable that he eventually gave up and simply accepted the reprimand for abandoning his duties. But Tommy knew that some experiences transcend the need for other people's understanding or approval. He had helped Helen Morrison find her way home after 70 years of searching, and he had learned that love can persist beyond death, beyond time, and beyond all the obstacles that separate us from the people we care about most. However, not all of Tommy's encounters with supernatural travelers would have such peaceful resolutions. Highway 50 attracted all kinds of spirits, and some of them carried darkness rather than light. David Chun had been working security at Riverside Medical Center in Sacramento for 4 years when he encountered the presence that would teach him the difference between spirits seeking peace and entities that feed on suffering. The hospital was a sprawling complex built in stages over 6 decades, with newer wings connected to older sections through a maze of corridors that could confuse even veteran employees. David worked the midnight to 8 shift, responsible for patrolling the entire facility and ensuring that all areas remained secure during the vulnerable overnight hours. The job required walking approximately 10 miles each night through hallways, stairwells, and basements that took on an entirely different character after visiting hours ended and most of the staff went home. Hospitals have their own unique energy that becomes more pronounced at night. The combination of hope and despair, healing and loss, creates an atmosphere that even the most skeptical people find unsettling. David had grown accustomed to the unusual sounds, the play of shadows in dimly lit corridors, and the occasional equipment alarms that would echo through empty wings. But he had also grown accustomed to the spirits that seemed to inhabit certain areas of the hospital. These were usually former patients or staff members who appeared briefly and benignly, often in locations where they had spent significant time during their lives. David had learned to acknowledge these presences with a polite nod and continue with his rounds, understanding that they posed no threat to anyone. The entity that changed everything was different from the peaceful spirits David had encountered before. It first appeared during his patrol of the psychiatric ward, a section of the hospital that had been closed for renovation after a fire had damaged several rooms 6 months earlier. David was checking the locks on doors that led to the closed ward when he first felt it. The sensation was like having someone walk over his grave. A chill that started at the base of his spine and spread through his entire body in a matter of seconds. He turned around quickly, expecting to find someone behind him, but the corridor was empty. The emergency lighting cast long shadows across the walls, creating shapes that seemed to move and shift as David watched. "Hello?" David called out, his voice echoing off the institutional tile walls. "This is security. Is anyone there?" The response came not as words but as a feeling of overwhelming malevolence, a presence that radiated hatred and hunger in equal measure. David felt his breathing become labored, as if the air around him had suddenly become thick and difficult to inhale. He reached for his radio to call the main security desk, but before he could key the microphone, every light in the corridor began to flicker. Not the random electrical problems that occasionally affected older sections of the hospital, but a coordinated pattern that started at one end of the hallway and moved toward David like a wave of darkness. As the lights flickered, David began to hear sounds that made his blood run cold. Screaming, sobbing, and moaning seemed to come from behind the locked doors of the closed psychiatric ward. The sounds were muffled but intense, as if dozens of people were experiencing extreme distress simultaneously. David knew that the psychiatric ward had been empty for months. The patients had been transferred to other facilities. The staff had been reassigned, and the entire area had been sealed off pending renovation. There was no possible way that anyone could be in those rooms, let alone an entire ward full of people in apparent agony. But the sounds continued, growing louder and more desperate with each passing moment. David could hear individual voices now, pleading for help, calling out names, and making sounds that spoke of pain beyond human endurance. David tried to radio for backup again, but his radio produced only static. He checked his cell phone and found that it showed no signal, despite the fact that the hospital had excellent cellular coverage throughout the building. The flickering lights began to move faster, and the sounds from behind the locked doors became a cacophony of human suffering that threatened to overwhelm David's sanity. He realized that he was experiencing something far beyond a typical supernatural encounter. This was something actively malevolent, something that wanted to cause harm rather than simply make its presence known. David began to back away from the psychiatric ward, but as he did, he felt an invisible force pushing against him, trying to force him toward the locked doors where the sounds of suffering continued to grow louder. The force was strong, like a powerful wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. David had to lean forward and fight for each step as he tried to retreat down the corridor toward the main part of the hospital. That's when he saw it clearly for the first time. At the far end of the corridor, near the entrance to the psychiatric ward, a dark figure began to materialize. It was roughly human in shape but composed entirely of what looked like shifting shadows. As it became more solid, David could see that it was tall and thin, with long arms that ended in fingers like black claws. The entity's face was the most terrifying thing David had ever seen. Where features should have been, there was only a void that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. But somehow, David could sense that it was smiling, taking pleasure in his fear and the sounds of anguish that continued to pour from the locked rooms. David understood then that this was not a ghost or spirit but something much more dangerous. This was an entity that fed on suffering, that had somehow been drawn to the hospital by the pain and trauma that had occurred in the psychiatric ward over the decades. The entity began to move toward David, not walking but gliding across the floor without any visible means of locomotion. As it approached, the temperature in the corridor dropped dramatically, and David's breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. David turned and ran, abandoning all pretense of professional calm or security protocols. Behind him, he could hear the entity pursuing him, making sounds that were part laughter and part screech, like the cry of some nightmare bird that had never existed in the natural world. David ran through corridors and down stairwells, the entity always just behind him but never quite catching up. He began to realize that it was playing with him, drawing out his terror like a cat toying with a mouse before delivering the final strike. He finally reached the main lobby of the hospital, where the bright lights and normal sounds of a functioning medical facility seemed to offer some protection from the darkness that pursued him. The entity stopped at the entrance to the lobby, as if unable or unwilling to enter the area where living people were working. David collapsed in a chair near the information desk, gasping for breath and trying to process what he had just experienced. The night supervisor, Alice Martinez, approached him with concern. "David, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." David almost laughed at the irony of her comment, but he managed to compose himself enough to give a believable explanation about checking on an alarm in the closed section of the building. Over the following days, David researched the history of the psychiatric ward and discovered information that explained the malevolent presence he had encountered. The ward had been the site of numerous tragedies over the decades, including patient suicides, violent incidents, and cases of abuse by staff members who had been prosecuted and imprisoned for their crimes. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of incidents from the 1970s, when a psychiatrist named Dr. Marcus Webb had conducted unauthorized experiments on patients with severe mental illness. Webb had been interested in what he called psychic vampirism, the theory that some individuals could feed on the emotional and psychic energy of others. Webb's experiments had involved subjecting patients to extreme psychological stress while monitoring their brain activity and vital signs. He believed he could identify and cultivate individuals with the ability to drain energy from others, potentially creating a new form of therapy based on transferring negative emotions from patients to willing recipients. The experiments had ended when several patients died under mysterious circumstances, all showing signs of extreme trauma despite no evidence of physical abuse. Webb had been arrested and convicted of manslaughter, dying in prison before he could complete his sentence. David realized that Webb's experiments had somehow created or attracted the entity he had encountered in the psychiatric ward. The combination of extreme suffering and Webb's twisted research had opened a doorway for something that fed on human anguish and trauma. David requested a transfer to a different shift that didn't require patrolling the closed psychiatric ward. But even during daylight hours, he could feel the entity's presence in that section of the hospital, waiting for darkness and solitude to resume its feeding. The renovation of the psychiatric ward was completed 3 months later, but the workers reported numerous incidents of unexplained accidents, equipment failures, and an overwhelming sense of dread that made it difficult to complete their tasks. Several workers quit before the project was finished, claiming that the area felt cursed or evil. When the ward reopened, it was converted to general medical use rather than psychiatric care. But the nurses and staff who worked in that section reported higher than normal rates of depression, anxiety, and burnout. Patient outcomes were also consistently worse than in other parts of the hospital, with longer recovery times and more complications. David eventually left his job at Riverside Medical Center and took a position at a smaller facility where the worst supernatural encounter involved the gentle spirit of a former nun who had worked in the hospital's charity ward for 40 years. But he never forgot the lesson he had learned during his encounter with Dr. Webb's legacy. Some supernatural entities are not lost souls seeking peace or comfort. Some are predators that have found ways to feed on human suffering, growing stronger and more dangerous with each victim they encounter. These entities don't want to be helped or released from their earthly bonds. They want to continue feeding, and they will use every tool at their disposal to maintain their access to the pain and fear that sustains them. David's experience taught him that not all darkness can be overcome with compassion and understanding. Sometimes, the only protection is distance, vigilance, and the wisdom to recognize when retreat is the only viable option. But the entity in the psychiatric ward was not the darkest presence that night workers would encounter in their solitary hours of vulnerability. Patricia Williams had been working as a night auditor at the Sleepy Inn Motel in Barstow, California for 8 months when she checked in the guest who would show her that some evils refused to stay buried, even when they should remain forgotten forever. The motel was a typical roadside establishment that served travelers crossing the Mojave Desert, offering basic accommodations to truckers, tourists, and the occasional fugitive who paid in cash and asked no questions. The Sleepy Inn had seen better days, but it maintained a steady clientele of regular customers who appreciated its low rates and Patricia's friendly, professional service. She had taken the night auditor position after losing her job as a bank teller, and she found that she enjoyed the quiet hours and the variety of people who passed through the desert crossroads. Most nights were routine, with guests checking in before midnight and the building settling into peaceful silence until morning. Patricia used the quiet hours to study for her real estate license exam, hoping to build a better career that would allow her to support her 2 teenage children as a single mother. But there were occasional nights when unusual guests would arrive, people whose stories didn't quite add up and whose presence made Patricia feel uneasy in ways she couldn't articulate. She had learned to trust her instincts about potentially dangerous customers, and she kept a loaded revolver in a locked drawer beneath the registration desk. The guest who changed everything arrived at 2:47 on a Wednesday morning in March. Patricia was reviewing the previous day's receipts when she heard a car pull into the parking lot, its engine running roughly as if it needed serious mechanical attention. Through the office window, she could see an old sedan, probably from the 1980s, with primer spots and rust damage that suggested years of hard use. The car sat in the parking lot for several minutes with the engine running before the driver finally got out and walked toward the office. He was a middle-aged man of average height and build, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair was unkempt, and his face had the gaunt appearance of someone who hadn't been eating regularly. But it was his eyes that made Patricia immediately uncomfortable. Pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through her as if she were nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "Good evening," Patricia said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite her growing unease. "Do you need a room for tonight?" The man approached the registration desk slowly, and Patricia noticed that his movements seemed deliberate and calculated, like a predator stalking prey. When he spoke, his voice was soft and cultured, completely at odds with his disheveled appearance. "Yes, I require accommodation for an indefinite period. I'm willing to pay cash in advance for an extended stay." Patricia nodded and reached for a registration form. Cash customers were common at the Sleepy Inn, and extended stays were good for business. "How long are you planning to stay?" she asked. The man smiled, and Patricia felt ice water flowing through her veins. His smile revealed teeth that were stained and broken, and there was something in his expression that suggested he found her question amusing for reasons she wouldn't want to understand. "Let's say I'll be here until I finish my work," he said. "My name is Dr. Raymond Kemp, and I'm conducting research that requires privacy and solitude." Patricia filled out the registration card with the information Dr. Kemp provided, though she noticed that he gave only a post office box for his address and declined to provide a phone number. When she asked for identification, he produced a driver's license that looked legitimate but somehow felt wrong, as if the photograph had been altered or the information falsified. Dr. Kemp paid for 2 weeks in advance using $100 bills that looked old and worn, as if they had been stored away for years before being brought out for this transaction. Patricia gave him the key to room 237, one of the units at the far end of the motel where he would have privacy from other guests. After Dr. Kemp left the office, Patricia made note of his license plate number and the unusual circumstances of his arrival. Something about the man triggered every warning instinct she had developed during her months of dealing with potentially dangerous customers. Over the following days, Patricia observed Dr. Kemp's behavior and found it increasingly disturbing. He never left his room during daylight hours, and his car remained parked in the same spot without moving. But at night, Patricia could see lights flickering in his room at all hours, and she occasionally heard sounds that made her skin crawl. The sounds were difficult to identify precisely, but they seemed to involve some kind of construction or assembly work. Patricia could hear hammering, drilling, and the movement of heavy objects across the floor. But when she asked Dr. Kemp about the noise during one of his rare visits to the office for ice or vending machine snacks, he claimed to be setting up equipment for his research. "What kind of research are you conducting?" Patricia asked, hoping to learn more about her mysterious guest. Dr. Kemp's pale eyes seemed to gleam with excitement as he answered, "I'm studying the boundary between life and death, my dear. I'm particularly interested in methods of preserving consciousness after physical death occurs." Patricia felt a chill run down her spine, but she tried to maintain normal conversation. "That sounds very scientific. Are you working with a university or research institution?" Dr. Kemp laughed, a sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "My research is far too advanced for conventional institutions. They lack the vision and the courage to pursue knowledge wherever it might lead." After that conversation, Patricia began to research Dr. Raymond Kemp online, hoping to learn more about her guest's background. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Dr. Kemp had been a forensic pathologist who had lost his medical license 15 years earlier after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on corpses. The allegations had been so disturbing that several states had opened criminal investigations, though Kemp had disappeared before any charges could be filed. According to the news reports Patricia found, Kemp had been obsessed with the idea of reanimating dead tissue and preserving human consciousness after death. Witnesses claimed he had been performing grotesque experiments in morgues and funeral homes, attempting to restore life to corpses using methods that violated every ethical and legal standard of medical practice. Patricia also discovered that Kemp had been connected to several unexplained disappearances of homeless people and runaway teenagers in cities where he had worked. Police suspected him of using living subjects for his experiments, but they had never been able to gather enough evidence to prosecute him. The most disturbing information Patricia found was a psychological evaluation that had been conducted during Kemp's medical license revocation hearing. The psychiatrist who examined him had concluded that Kemp suffered from severe narcissistic personality disorder combined with necrophiliac tendencies and complete absence of empathy for human suffering. Patricia realized that she had allowed a dangerous predator to take up residence at her motel, and she needed to find a way to remove him before he could harm anyone. But when she called the local sheriff's office to report her concerns, the deputy who took her call explained that they couldn't evict a paying customer based solely on his criminal history from other states. The situation escalated dramatically 3 nights later when Patricia was awakened at home by a call from a truck driver who was staying at the motel. "There's something terrible happening in room 237, the trucker reported, his voice shaking with fear. "I can hear screaming coming from inside, and I saw someone carrying what looked like a body bag from a van into that room." Patricia threw on clothes and drove to the motel as quickly as possible, calling 911 on her way. When she arrived, she found the truck driver and 2 other guests standing in the parking lot, all looking terrified and unwilling to go near room 237. The door to Dr. Kemp's room was standing open, and Patricia could see flickering candlelight from inside. There was also a smell in the air that made her stomach lurch, the unmistakable odor of decay and chemicals mixed together in a combination that spoke of death and perversion. Patricia waited in the parking lot until sheriff's deputies arrived, then accompanied them as they investigated room 237. What they found inside was so disturbing that 2 of the officers had to leave the room to compose themselves. Dr. Kemp had converted the motel room into a makeshift laboratory where he was conducting experiments on human corpses. The bodies appeared to be those of homeless people and transients who wouldn't be immediately missed by anyone. But the most horrifying discovery was that some of the bodies showed signs that Kemp had been attempting to reanimate them using electrical stimulation and chemical injections. Partially decomposed corpses were connected to car batteries and primitive life support equipment, creating a scene that looked like something from a horror movie. Dr. Kemp himself was found dead in the room's bathroom, apparently from a heart attack brought on by exposure to the toxic chemicals he had been using in his experiments. His body showed signs that he had been conducting experiments on himself as well, with surgical scars and chemical burns that suggested he had been testing his reanimation techniques on his own living tissue. The investigation that followed revealed that Dr. Kemp had been traveling across the country for years, staying at small motels and conducting his grotesque experiments on victims he abducted from the streets. Police estimated that he had killed at least 30 people during his decade-long spree of medical madness. The Sleepy Inn was closed for 2 weeks while hazmat teams cleaned and decontaminated room 237. But even after the room was declared safe, Patricia found that no guests would stay in it. The other motel employees reported cold spots, strange smells, and the sound of machinery running at all hours of the night. Patricia quit her job at the Sleepy Inn 1 month after Dr. Kemp's death. She couldn't forget the images she had seen in room 237, and she found herself having nightmares about partially reanimated corpses pursuing her through the motel's corridors. But the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience was Patricia's growing suspicion that Dr. Kemp's experiments might have achieved some measure of success. Other night workers at nearby businesses reported seeing a figure that matched Kemp's description walking along the highway after midnight, always heading toward the Sleepy Inn as if trying to return to his makeshift laboratory. Local urban legends soon developed around the story of Dr. Kemp's experiments. People claimed that room 237 was haunted not just by Kemp's spirit, but by the tortured souls of his victims, who had been denied peaceful death by his attempts to trap them between life and the afterlife. Patricia moved to another state and took a day shift job where she would never again have to deal with the dangerous solitude of overnight work. But she carried with her the knowledge that some people become so consumed by their obsessions that death itself cannot stop them from continuing their twisted pursuits. She had learned that the night shift attracts all kinds of people, including those who use the darkness and isolation to hide activities that would be impossible to conceal during daylight hours. And she had discovered that some evils are so profound that they continue to influence the world even after the people who committed them are dead and gone. But Dr. Kemp's legacy was not the darkest presence that would emerge from the shadows where night workers faced their greatest fears alone. Rachel Martinez had been working as a paramedic in Detroit for 12 years when she received the emergency call that would teach her that some rescues lead to destinations far worse than death itself. She was partnered with Jake Thompson, a veteran EMT with 20 years of experience, and together they formed one of the most effective emergency response teams in the city. Detroit's night shift was particularly challenging, with emergency calls ranging from routine medical situations to violent crimes that left paramedics dealing with the worst aspects of human suffering. Rachel had seen every kind of trauma imaginable during her career, and she prided herself on maintaining professional composure even in the most horrific circumstances. The call that changed everything came in at 3:22 on a Thursday morning in January. The dispatcher's voice crackled through their radio with an urgency that immediately put both Rachel and Jake on high alert. Unit 17, respond to 1247 Corktown Street for an unconscious female, approximately 30 years old. Caller reports the victim appears to be in severe distress but is unable to provide additional details. Police are en route. Rachel knew the address immediately. It was in one of Detroit's most notorious abandoned neighborhoods, where entire city blocks sat empty except for drug dealers, squatters, and people who had fallen through every crack in the social safety net. Corktown had once been a thriving working-class community, but economic collapse and urban decay had transformed it into a wasteland of empty houses and overgrown lots. Emergency responders approached calls in that area with extra caution, knowing that they might be walking into dangerous situations with no backup readily available. Rachel and Jake reached the address in 12 minutes, their ambulance bouncing over potholed streets and past boarded-up buildings that looked like monuments to urban decay. The house at 1247 Corktown Street was a two-story Victorian that had probably been beautiful when it was built over a century ago, but now stood as a deteriorating shell with broken windows and a collapsing front porch. The police had not yet arrived, which was unusual for calls in this part of the city. Rachel tried to radio for an update on their ETA but received only static in response. No police backup, Jake observed, checking his watch. That's weird. They're usually here before we are in this neighborhood. Rachel felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Emergency protocols required police presence before paramedics could enter potentially dangerous situations, especially in areas known for drug activity and violence. But through the broken front window of the house, they could see flickering candlelight and hear the sound of someone moaning in apparent distress. If there was a victim inside who needed immediate medical attention, waiting for police backup could mean the difference between life and death. We go in, Rachel decided, but we stay together and we leave at the first sign of trouble. Jake nodded and grabbed their medical kit from the ambulance. They approached the front door carefully, noting that it was standing slightly ajar despite the freezing January weather. "Hello?" Rachel called out as they entered the house. "This is Detroit EMS. We received a call about someone needing medical assistance." The interior of the house was lit by dozens of candles placed throughout what had once been a living room. The furniture was covered with sheets and looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. The walls were water-stained and peeling, and there was a smell in the air that reminded Rachel of old graves and decaying flowers. "Up here," a woman's voice called from somewhere on the second floor. "Please hurry. She's getting worse." Rachel and Jake climbed the creaking staircase, their flashlights adding to the eerie candlelight that illuminated their path. The second floor contained 4 rooms, 3 of which were empty except for debris and graffiti left by previous trespassers. The 4th room contained a scene that would haunt Rachel's dreams for years to come. A young woman was lying on a mattress in the center of the room, surrounded by more candles and what appeared to be medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a modern emergency response. The woman was unconscious and extremely pale, with dark circles under her eyes and skin that had taken on a grayish pallor. But it was the person attending to her that made Rachel's blood run cold. Standing beside the mattress was an elderly woman dressed in a nurse's uniform that looked like it was from the 1940s. Her hair was pinned back in an old-fashioned style, and she wore a white cap that nurses hadn't used in decades. Her face was kind but somehow wrong, as if she were a photograph that had been slightly out of focus. "Thank goodness you're here," the elderly nurse said. "I've been trying to help her, but my techniques seem to be ineffective with modern patients." Rachel knelt beside the unconscious woman and began checking her vital signs. Her pulse was weak and rapid, her blood pressure was dangerously low, and her skin felt ice-cold despite the warm temperature in the room from all the burning candles. "What happened to her?" Rachel asked while Jake began setting up their equipment. The elderly nurse looked confused, as if the question didn't make sense. "She's suffering from hysteria complicated by melancholia," the nurse replied. "I've been treating her with the standard protocols, but she doesn't seem to be responding to bloodletting or mercury treatments." Rachel stared at the elderly nurse in disbelief. Bloodletting and mercury treatments had been abandoned by modern medicine for over a century, and hysteria and melancholia were outdated diagnoses that reflected the medical understanding of a much earlier era. "Ma'am, I need you to step back so we can provide proper medical care," Rachel said firmly. The elderly nurse looked offended by Rachel's request. "Young lady, I have been practicing medicine for over 40 years. I hardly think you're qualified to override my clinical judgment." Rachel looked more closely at the elderly nurse and realized that something was terribly wrong with her appearance. Her skin had a waxy, translucent quality that reminded Rachel of the corpses she had seen in morgues. Her eyes were cloudy and unfocused, as if she were blind or looking at something that existed in a different dimension. Most disturbing of all, the elderly nurse cast no shadow despite the bright candlelight that filled the room. She appeared solid and real, but the laws of physics didn't seem to apply to her presence. Jake finished his assessment of the unconscious woman and looked up at Rachel with concern. "She's been drugged with something I don't recognize," he said quietly. "Her symptoms look like some kind of poisoning, but the toxicology is unlike anything I've seen before." Rachel turned back to the elderly nurse. "What medications have you given her?" The nurse smiled proudly, as if discussing her greatest professional achievements. "I've administered laudanum for her nervous condition, mercury for her blood impurities, and a small dose of arsenic to balance her humors. She should be responding positively within a few hours." Rachel felt her heart stop. Laudanum was liquid opium that had been used as a painkiller in the 19th century before its addictive properties were understood. Mercury and arsenic were both highly toxic substances that had been used by physicians who didn't understand their deadly effects on human health. The elderly nurse had been poisoning her patient using medical treatments that had been abandoned over a century ago because they killed more people than they helped. "You're killing her," Rachel said, her voice rising with alarm and anger. The elderly nurse looked genuinely confused by Rachel's accusation. "Nonsense, dear. These treatments have been proven effective for decades. I trained at the finest medical college in Boston, and my methods have saved hundreds of patients over the years." Rachel began administering antidotes and supportive care to counteract the poisons the elderly nurse had given to her victim. As she worked, she tried to understand how this situation had developed and who the elderly nurse really was. "What's your name?" Rachel asked while inserting in 4 lines. "I am Nurse Margaret Whitfield, and I have been serving patients in this community since 1943. Though I must say, medical education has clearly declined significantly since my training. Your techniques are quite unorthodox." Rachel remembered reading about Nurse Margaret Whitfield in a historical article about Detroit's medical community. Whitfield had been a well-respected nurse who had worked in the city for 40 years before her death in 1987. She had been known for her dedication to patient care and her adherence to medical practices from her training era, even when those practices had become outdated. But according to the article, Nurse Whitfield had suffered from dementia during her final years, becoming confused about time periods and insisting on using medical treatments that had been abandoned decades earlier. She had been removed from patient care after several incidents where her outdated methods had endangered people's lives. "You're dead," Rachel said, the words coming out before she could stop herself. Nurse Whitfield looked shocked by the accusation. "Don't be ridiculous, young lady. I'm here helping patients, just as I've done every day for the past 40 years. Rachel realized that Nurse Whitfield's spirit had remained trapped in her role as a caregiver, but her understanding of medical practice was frozen in the era when she had learned her profession. She was trying to help people using methods that were now understood to be deadly. The unconscious woman began to convulse as the toxins in her system reached critical levels. Rachel and Jake worked frantically to stabilize her while Nurse Whitfield watched with growing agitation. "You're making her worse," Nurse Whitfield accused. "Your modern methods are interfering with proper treatment." Rachel ignored the ghostly nurse and focused on saving her patient's life. They managed to get the woman stabilized enough to transport to the hospital, where emergency room physicians worked for hours to counteract the effects of mercury and arsenic poisoning. The woman survived, but barely. She had been a runaway teenager who had sought shelter in the abandoned house, only to encounter Nurse Whitfield's deadly form of supernatural care. When Rachel and Jake returned to the house later to investigate further, they found evidence of Nurse Whitfield's activities throughout the building. Empty bottles that had once contained laudanum, mercury, and arsenic were hidden in various rooms. Medical equipment from the 1940s was set up in what appeared to be a makeshift hospital ward. Most disturbing of all, they found the skeletal remains of several people in the basement, all showing signs of mercury and arsenic poisoning. Nurse Whitfield had been caring for vulnerable people for decades, slowly killing them with treatments she genuinely believed were helping them recover. The house was eventually demolished by the city, but reports continued of a nurse in a white uniform approaching homeless people and drug addicts in other abandoned buildings throughout Detroit. She would offer medical care to people who were desperate enough to accept help from anyone, then slowly poison them while believing she was providing the finest medical treatment available. Rachel transferred to a different district after her encounter with Nurse Whitfield, but she never forgot the lesson she had learned. Sometimes the most dangerous supernatural entities are those who continue to act according to their deepest beliefs and convictions, even when those beliefs have become deadly and obsolete. Nurse Whitfield wasn't evil in the traditional sense. She was a dedicated caregiver who was trapped in an outdated understanding of medical practice. But her good intentions made her no less lethal to the people who encountered her supernatural form of care. Rachel's experience taught her that the road to hell really is paved with good intentions, and that some forms of help can be more dangerous than no help at all. It also reinforced her understanding that death doesn't automatically grant wisdom or update a person's knowledge to match modern understanding. The spirits of the past carry with them the limitations and mistakes of their era. And when those limitations involve matters of life and death, the results can be catastrophic for the living people who cross their paths. But Rachel's encounter with Nurse Whitfield was only the beginning of her education about the dangers that lurk in the shadows where night workers faced the unknown alone. Her most terrifying experience was still ahead of her. As dawn breaks across America, millions of night workers complete their shifts and head home to rest while the world awakens around them. They've spent 8 or 12 hours in the liminal space between yesterday and today, holding down the essential jobs that keep our society functioning while most people sleep safely in their beds. But as these 10 stories have shown, working the night shift means more than just staying awake while others sleep. It means venturing into a realm where the normal rules don't always apply, where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes permeable, and where encounters with the impossible become part of the job description. Sarah the nurse learned that love and compassion can transcend death itself, creating networks of protection that watch over both patients and caregivers. Marcus the security guard discovered that some entities feed on fear and isolation, growing stronger in places where people feel abandoned and forgotten. Roberto the taxi driver found that the departed sometimes need help completing their final journeys, while Jennifer the hotel clerk learned that not all supernatural guests have peaceful intentions. Maria the diner waitress faced a predator that had been hunting for decades, and Harold the janitor helped complete a lesson that had been interrupted by tragedy nearly a century earlier. Tommy the gas station attendant reunited lovers who had been separated by death for over 70 years, while David the security guard encountered evil that fed on human suffering. Patricia the night auditor discovered that some obsessions persist beyond death, and Rachel the paramedic learned that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. Each of these encounters teaches us something important about the nature of death, consciousness, and the mysteries that surround human existence. They remind us that our understanding of reality is limited, and that there are forces in the world that science has yet to explain or acknowledge. But perhaps most importantly, these stories illustrate the courage and dedication of the people who work through the night, maintaining the essential services that the rest of us take for granted. They face not only the ordinary challenges of their professions, but also the extraordinary encounters that emerge from the darkness when the world becomes quiet and still. Night workers are the guardians of the threshold between day and night, between the known and unknown, between the living and whatever comes after. They witness things that daylight workers never see, and they carry burdens that most people couldn't imagine. So the next time you see a night nurse walking to her car at dawn, a security guard beginning his evening patrol, or a taxi driver starting his overnight shift, remember that they're entering a world where anything is possible. They're taking on responsibilities that go far beyond their job descriptions, serving as bridges between our rational daylight world and the mysteries that flourish in the darkness. These 10 stories represent just a small sample of the supernatural encounters reported by night workers across America. There are thousands of others, each with their own lessons about death, consciousness, and the thin veil that separates the world of the living from whatever lies beyond. But now, as our journey through these haunted encounters comes to an end, you might be wondering what other supernatural mysteries await discovery in the places where most people fear to venture. If these stories have left you craving more encounters with the unknown, then you're going to love our next exploration of America's most haunted locations. Join us as we visit 10 places where the supernatural doesn't just visit occasionally, but has taken up permanent residence, creating environments where the paranormal has become the normal. From abandoned hospitals where the dead refuse to check out, to historic hotels where guests from past centuries still demand room service, our next journey will take you inside the buildings and locations where America's ghosts feel most at home. Click the end screen now to discover the 10 most haunted places in America, where the supernatural isn't just a possibility but a guarantee. These are the locations where even the most skeptical visitors become believers, and where the line between our world and the next has been permanently erased. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest supernatural investigations. And let us know in the comments which of tonight's stories affected you the most. Have you ever worked a night shift where you encountered something that couldn't be explained by logic or science? Sweet dreams, and remember, when you're alone in the darkness, you might not be as alone as you think.